So this is the Planning Commission meeting for Tuesday, December 5th, 2017. If we all stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Is there any audience comments that aren't on the agenda?
He's our presenter.
Is he on the agenda? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Seeing none, we'll move on to the business items. So it's the presentation and discussion for the draft design standards.
All right, and I'd like to just briefly introduce this topic. As part of the 2017-2018 biennial budget, the City Council budgeted funds to hire a consultant to write architectural and site design standards. And so the city went through a selection process and hired Makers Architecture and Urban Design. Bob Langford is here tonight from Makers to present the draft standards and explain to you kind of how they work. This is in advance of a public hearing that we're expecting to hold in January on the proposed standards. And so we've had an open house now where we had members of the community and a few council members showed up and kind of were able to walk around and look at the standards and have also seen a similar presentation. And so this is your opportunity to dig into the material and start to comprehend it and formulate any questions that you have in advance of a public hearing. So I will turn it over to Bob.
Thank you, Nick. Good evening, planning commissioners. Also, the draft that I'm sure all of you read here on the page, it's the same version that everybody had with the. Hello? Okay.
Thank you.
It's the same version that everybody had with the open house. So just to keep that in mind, we've got a few notes here and there, and I'll try to call some things out as we go through it. And also, in talking to Nick today, we know that staff's going to be doing a more in-depth review of the draft and help us with any tweaks or typos or things like that. So just keep that in mind. Let me see, where's the... So I have a lot of slides here and a lot of visuals. How much have folks had a chance to kind of peek at this document so far? Look over it pretty good? A little bit? Okay. Well, I got a lot of slides here to kind of walk you through it, and some of it may be a little bit redundant. Particularly some of these early slides, I pretty much have the same slideshows I went through with the public meeting, and part of that was that it sounds like, I don't think any of you were here at the open house, but were any of you at the on the tour that we did, the town center tour? Okay, you were, Mark. Great. So as far as just why, I think the big part there is that understanding that the existing design guidelines and the review process don't seem like they're working very well and kind of fitting where the city wants to go. So that's the big one. The other part is the need for complete citywide design standards covering commercial and multifamily. Obviously, economic development is a big deal, and the other part with all the anticipated residential growth that expected here in the amount of extra build-out land in the city, that these standards are going to be a critical tool to really shape the growth of the city from here on out. Let's see here. Do I have to point it?
The down button?
The down one?
Well, you can tell me in how advance it.
Wait, did that work? Okay.
I moved it.
Oh. Okay. So the goals are really trying to provide clear objectives. Is it working? So down? Okay. Clear objectives for the design of commercial multifamily projects to try to ensure higher quality of development that benefits both residents and businesses. The corridors are a big deal, so enhancing the appearance of the corridors. compatibility with the neighborhoods, particularly where there's commercial adjacent to the neighborhoods, and as well as promoting more walking and bicycling within the city, commercial and multifamily areas, and as a tool to maintain and enhance property values as well. Maybe it's where I'm
Maybe
sitting.
you can just add this, there you go, I think just point it.
Okay. So what's happened so far, we've reviewed closely the comp plan and the existing design standards and did a little bit of an audit with that. We conducted a tour with staff and with many of the city officials, which was great and super helpful for everybody together to see some of these examples and how they evolved. Didn't happen overnight. It was kind of a process for including Burien and Bothell. We also did an urban design a tour with staff before that of just driving through the city. Scott Bonjukian, who's working with me at Makers, used to work here and is from here, so that really has helped us because he knows the place obviously inside and out. And so when we did the tour, kind of looking at how these things could be applied to the various corridors and growing parts of the city. And we held 2 advisory committee meetings going through the standards in detail and had some good discussion on some of the issues there. And of course, our November 15th, the public workshop. Oop. Little too, let's see, where am I here? Okay. Oh, go up one. There we go. That might be easier. So one of the big things that we're trying to do with these design standards is get that right mix of predictability and flexibility. Because right now, your guidelines aren't very predictable. They might be flexible, but no one knows what a guideline really from a standard. So really, as part of what Makers has been trying to do, working with cities on this, is to generally providing clear minimum standards so that applicants and decision makers and community members understand what the minimum requirements are, but then offering a number of ways that you can integrate some flexibility. So some of those are like having a toolbox of options where you say, okay, you need to do at least 2 of these from a list to meet the standards. So that's one way of offering flexibility. The other one is offering departure opportunities, which are kind of like a variance, but they're more of a voluntary thing, and you don't have to meet, you know, you can sort of make up what the big criteria is. You have to meet the intent and the purpose statements of the particular design standards. I'll talk a little bit more, and I'll give you some examples as we go through these. But it's an important tool that we've found that has worked really well. Because some of the design, particularly the building design standards, it's important occasionally to have some flexibility, especially when you have prescriptive standards. At the same time, giving staff in the community good criteria for how those are accepted or not. Let's go to the next slide. So these design standards would apply to commercial and multifamily citywide. So that means everything except single and 2-family development dwellings, duplexes, and it would exclude development in the old Clifton Industrial Park. So multifamily, anything from a triplex up, but there is, regarding some of the industrial types of zones, we've included some language there offering a little bit of flexibility, saying that the review authority may waive or relax provisions in the industrial zones depending on the type of use, the number of anticipated employees and customers, and the visibility of the site. So it was kind of a situation where we didn't want to give it seemed too strict to require everything to apply, but yet it seemed too loose to apply nothing. So this is kind of the halfway in between provision that allows the director to offer a little bit of flexibility depending on the situation there. Let's go to the next slide. So again, the zoning map, of course, all the areas in red, which kind of look like they're black here. and again, the multifamily areas. So that it would not apply to all those yellow areas, for instance. Let's keep going. So the review process, and this is the thing that we've been talking with in the past week here, and how this would fit in with your review process and some of the codes that you recently adopted for your different decision types, permit, review, decision types. So our idea here is your general design review would really be integrated with whatever your applicable permit is. So building permit, land disturbing activity permit, storm water drainage permit. So building permit and land disturbing activity, those are type 1 decisions that are staff review, director approval, and appeal to the Superior Court. And I believe there's no notice requirements for those.
Unless it's a SEPA, unless
That's
it's
right.
required on the project, then there is a public notice. We're actually talking right now because the stormwater drainage permits and land disturbing activity permits, land disturbing is a type 1, which is administrative. Stormwater is a type 2,
Yeah.
but Public Works is actually expressing an interest in turning that into a type 1 process. So that may or may not change here moving forward. In any event, the difference between those is where the appeal goes and also the public noticing requirements for a project. There's much more public notice for a type 2 permit compared to a type 1 permit in terms of the sign on the property telling you that a project's going to happen, as well as notice in the paper and mailings.
And one option with these departures I was just talking about, one option is to have it go through maybe the type 2 review instead. So there's that extra level of review. So that would require a pre-application meeting, which I think would be really important, particularly with the new set of standards. Notice of application would be required. It'd still be an administrative decision, but there would be the appeal to the hearing examiner. So it'd be kind of a way to just ensure that there's a little bit of extra notice and different appeal opportunity there for departures. So that's something that we had just talked about this week, and that's an option to think about. And it's particularly as you look through at all these departure opportunities. So the departures only apply to those things where we say there's a departure opportunity. There's probably maybe about 20 or 25 different specific departure opportunities in the document. So when you're looking at it, look closely at where those are. Let's keep rolling along here. Just stop me anytime you have any questions or comments. The other important thing is to set how these apply to remodels and additions. This is always one of those things that comes up, especially early when I started doing some of these with cities, and then they would call me afterwards and well, how does this apply to their expanding the building here? And so we've tried to be pretty flexible in how this occurs, because if you're too strict on this and you apply too much conformance with the standards, then you may stifle development and really discourage any upgrades to the existing buildings. So what we've done here is we've set up 3 different levels of, we call them improvements. So level 1, level 2, and level 3 improvements. And level 1 is simply if you're just doing a remodel of the space and you're not adding any additional floor area. And in that case, just the exterior, whatever you're working on needs to comply and not lead to any greater conformance. So let's say you have a 7-Eleven type of thing where you have a parking lot in the front, but maybe the standards say if you were to build a new building there, you'd have to put the parking in the back and have the building in front. Well, in that case, you would just, let's say 7-Eleven goes out of business and something else comes in. Whatever you're changing to the exterior, the windows and all that stuff, they need to be consistent with those building design standards then, but you wouldn't have to change the parking lot location or any of that stuff. But if you're starting to look at additions, so an addition up to 75% of the floor area of the existing building, then the building design standards apply, and some of the other site improvements would apply, except for, you know, moving the parking lot around, but you might need to provide like a pathway between the street and the entry, and maybe you might have to do some landscaping improvements, so it kind of ratchets up your site improvements. Block frontage concept, so the big part of what we're focusing on here is what you see from the street, and we're looking at it throughout the whole city on a kind of a block by block basis. So this approach, we found it works pretty good. It's one of the better ways because recognize that not every street is the same, and it helps us tailor the situation to fit, tailor the standards to fit the situation that you have or want to have. So we found it to be adaptable to, if situations change, you could change a block frontage designation, and we think it's predictable. So there's a chart there that I think the next slide shows the bigger version. So there's the series of maps in there that I'll go through, but now the colors turned out pretty funny on this up
I
here.
think it's the projector, not the PowerPoint.
So the storefront is actually, that color's red, but it's intended to be color coded. And so the storefront, marine, mixed, landscape, those are all block frontage designations. And then for each of those have different types of frontages that are permitted or required, and they address different parking lot location standards. And there's some other provisions in there like transparency and some landscaping provisions. And I'll just kind of go through some and show you a lot of pictures of what they mean. Next slide. So a storefront is simply that, a storefront, but we have the ability here to integrate some key standards. Like here we've suggested you need to have weather protection, for instance, at least 6 feet deep along 80% of the facade, not the whole thing, but 80%. Transparency, and there you can see transparency would be between 30 inches above the sidewalk up to 10 feet and at least 60% of the facade. So a lot of transparency, so you could look into the businesses. The other thing is have the entry facing the street. And the last thing is the important thing for retail is having a tall floor to ceiling height for these storefront spaces to really be adaptable to different retailers. You want to have that tall. So we're suggesting 15 feet, which is sort of where things are trending for retailers now to create those attractive spaces. So those are the base examples. For parking, if you're on a storefront designated street and you're building a new building, parking would be in the back or on the side. You can have up to, you got to have parking somewhere. So we're saying up to 60 feet of frontage of parking, but you can't do parking in the front. Next slide. And so these are some examples of that. Go to the next slide. These are some examples here. You can see the antique building there. It would meet most of our standards, except for it doesn't have the weather protection, except for over the recessed entry there. We're working in a number of cities like Anacortes right now, and they recently had their big hotel expand many years ago. The picture is there, but it really differs, for instance, from the old part of the hotel, and they put windows in. It doesn't really kind of match the historic character, for instance, and they didn't put any weather protection. So I wanted to include that here is, you know, that would not meet the standards. It might have enough transparency, but the key thing, it wouldn't have the weather protection, for instance. Next slide. So next street frontage type is what we call landscaped, and that's pretty much that you need a setback, and typically those are landscaped. So on landscape designations, you need to have a little bit of transparency, entries, building entries facing the street. There's still some parking lot location standards. So again, we say parking in the back is okay, some parking on the side. In this case, we say up to half of your lot frontage, and you cannot, again, do parking in the front. Some examples of that here, they could be residential, commercial, there's a townhouse example there. It could be like the Starbucks. In that case, they have a little plaza out in front, and that would meet the standards. Next slide. Some local examples of that. It's actually hard to find good local examples of this block frontage type, but you're actually right out on the other side of this building. And isn't that the library, the courthouse? Okay. And then two other designations that are important are mixed and marine. Mixed are pretty much a combination of the two, where you give the owner a choice of whether they want to do a storefront or have a landscape setback. And oftentimes those are in either the edge of downtown or areas that you might want to make more pedestrian friendly and allow that choice. And marine is the same. I'll go to the next slide here and I'll explain it a little more. Again, mixed. Yeah, the colors are hard to read, but in this case, most of the streets here, actually the street out here, for instance, would be mixed. And right now, you can see why. That again, that would allow, it's kind of the edge of downtown. If someone wants to use their whole property, they could do that and have that storefront right on the street, or they can have a building like on the left there. And again, parking location standards are important, trying to make it more pedestrian oriented, so not allowing that parking in the front of the building, other than the street parking, of course. And then the marine designation is along a lot of the areas along the water. And that's because it's, in some of these areas, it's hard to, you got to put parking somewhere. So it has pretty much the same standards as mixed and tries to get parking around the side and the rear, but it has special departure language that allows an opportunity to put parking in the front, provided you can mitigate the impacts and integrate design features. Another example of a block frontage type is the gateway frontage type, which is mostly a bigger landscaping setback. So there we say 25 feet. And there we wouldn't have any parking location standards. You can have it in the front. The main thing is that extra landscaping, and that's Tremont is the one main corridor that we're looking at that designation. Another thing that you'll see on the map are these little yellow triangles, and those are where we think are important street corners where when new development occurs that maybe have more articulated building corners. And what I mean by that are these types of examples where you might have a cropped corner like the building in the upper right here, or like a tower like this, or change in building materials, or like this Bainbridge building that has a corner plaza. And so we've strategically looked at all the different areas in the commercial mixed use areas and taken a stab at that, but we can use your help there too. In fact, I think that's what we'll want to look at more closely too with staff and figuring out, because I think there might be some other corners that we might want to add that designation to. So there's a lot of maps here because there's a lot of commercial multifamily areas. There's actually 16 of these maps that we looked at all these blocks and integrated designations for those. And I'll run through these quickly. Downtown being one of the most important that we're all aware of. And again, the colors don't really show up here like they do on the paper copies. But the storefronts pretty much try to reinforce the conditions as they exist in the core along Bay. And in some cases, they wrap around up to a half block off of the street. So we also decided that up on this corner here, heading into the core, that's where the breaking point between the mixed and the marine and the storefront designation would be. So that's really trying to get maybe an extra half block there to kind of extend that downtown core, similar to the east. So the other thing is we show is the on Bay Street. Go back one real quick. Sorry. So between here and here, the waterfront side of Bay Street is the marine designation, but the upland side is mixed. And you pretty much have the same thing up as we head to the next map. But one other thing I wanted to check on that map was that we do show at some point a connection in the back here, so on the back side of these buildings. And so that would be, as there's redevelopment, to try to get this would either be a street or a pathway connection there. And we also show the trail, the waterfront trail route back here as well. Okay, now and then heading to the east here along Bay. It's a similar setup where we show the marine designation on the water. Again, trying to make this, if this ever redevelops, particularly this side, trying to make that more pedestrian oriented as much as you can, but recognizing some of the challenges, you got to put the parking somewhere. And then the upland sides being the mixed designation. So it'd be an example if the storage units over here would ever redevelop, they have an opportunity to either be a storefront right there on Bay or have that landscape setback. Let's go to the next one. And then heading down Bethel corridor, we have the roundabout right here, and that's where we're showing the landscape designation. But along the whole rest of it, we're showing the mixed designation. And so that would really, if you extend down Bethel, quite a change. Or right now, it's pretty much just everything is set back, parking in the front. So I think overall, in the future, gradually trying to make this corridor more pedestrian friendly, get more buildings up closer to the street, but allowing some flexibility for parking. And then in this big center here, these black lines again show the desire to have, if and when this is redeveloped, to have streets and internal access routes integrated into that to break it up a little bit. So that's what those dashed lines are. And so here, this is looking south on Bethel.
Safeway and Walmart on the left.
Yeah. So again, I believe we showed most of this being a mixed designation. Here we go. So here's Bethel heading to the south. So all of these we show the mixed designation along these areas. And then I believe here's the Walmart south of Lund. And again, we show already there's an internal connection there. And so we show a couple more of those connections. So if and when there's redevelopment in the future in those areas. So again, hopefully these would probably have a big difference in influencing the types of redevelopment that occur along these corridors in the future. Now, when you look at the Sedgwick connection towards the freeway here, again, the colors are a little off here, but this is supposed to be orange and show the gateway designation where you have a landscape emphasis as you get closer to the freeway. But from here over, I believe this is supposed to be green and landscaped along this portion of Sedgwick. And again, there's a lot of redevelopment potential, or actually just plain old development potential in this area. And so we show the mixed designation here, and then in the back, more of it as it blends into the neighborhood, the landscape designation. And we're showing the new street connections that I believe that on there, working with Public Works, probably already have those street connections in. And then Tremont, that's where we're showing the gateway designation here, and then the landscape designation along these streets. And again, the improvement plan with the roundabouts there planned for Tremont. So we think the gateway designation will work well with that. And again, there's flexibility on parking lot locations along those corridors. And then on the other side of the freeway, the Sydney-Sedgwick corridor, that's kind of a developing little neighborhood center area, crossroads. So, rather than the anything goes, put the parking lot in the front, these mixed designations would try to make those a little more, they would push the development there to try to orient things a little bit more towards the road and think about that a little bit more than under your current situation. And then beyond the crossroads, it extends to the landscape designation to the north of Sydney there, and also to the west. Any questions, comments on any of the, I know that's a lot of info, but what we can use is if you do have any suggestions or you see a designation that doesn't seem right and could change, we'd love to see any suggestions you might have in tweaking these maps, because these were just this is basically me and Scott and Carrie and Nick kind of going through and taking our best stab at these designations based on what we see there now, what the comp plan says, and what we believe the opportunities might be, and also thinking about some of the developments that have been coming in and are interested in those areas. So the next part of the standards here get into the site planning chapter, and these look at things like relationship to adjacent properties, circulation stuff, both pedestrian and vehicular, open space standards for both commercial and residential, and service elements. So internal circulation, pretty standard stuff here, really trying to just make sure that when new development occurs, that there's good both vehicular and pedestrian connections on the site, crosswalks, connections to adjacent properties, so you have a good both pedestrian and vehicular circulation that's safe. The other thing is we look at as new like shopping centers develop, the design of those internal circulation networks. So rather than your shopping centers having a walkway like this without any trees, being very utilitarian and narrow, the standards would require something more like this, where you have a little bit wider. You might have some trees there to make it look and function more like a sidewalk, more attractive to pedestrians who might have to walk. Here's another example of that, maybe even integrating some pedestrian lights, but trying to make sure that when those retail developments go in, that they're more than just the utilitarian, auto-oriented strip mall. Residential open space is another thing that's really important. So making sure that you have some minimum standards for both for the amount of usable open space for apartments and townhomes, and to make sure that they're designed and not afterthoughts. So what we say here is at least 100 square foot per dwelling unit for studio and one bedroom, and 150 square foot of open space for 2 bedrooms and up. And there's some options in how you meet that. So one of them is shared open space up to all of your requirements there. Also balconies, individual outdoor spaces, like if you're a townhome, for instance, naturally those are gonna meet the requirements. And then in some buildings, common indoor rec area, if you're a mixed use building, you can meet part of that by doing that for mixed use. And also shared rooftop decks can be used up to half for your residential buildings, and up to 100% if you're a mixed use building. So examples, here's some of your examples of shared open space. Go to your next slide. I got a few examples here. So they can look like this. Some of you might have seen this development on Bainbridge, where they integrated some old trees into their common open space, or this nice example, which actually sits on top of a parking deck. Or in some cases, a mixed-use building like this, where it's a courtyard and it serves the commercial areas, and it's a visual and functional amenity for the apartments above. Children's play areas, rooftop deck example, and here's your example of like a townhouse that integrates both the balconies and ground floor residential ground floor space. And the idea here is, here's an example. I've worked in Ellensburg. Some of the examples there where you just have, they provided space, but they didn't design it well. It's got a slope. They don't really have any amenities for it. So it's just more of an afterthought and kind of cheap. So the idea here is to make sure that It's not an afterthought. There are some amenities that you think about the location and what's around it and adjacent to it. Also for commercial open space, so where you have new developments that are at least 1 acre in size, except for industrial, you would require some usable plaza type space, pedestrian oriented space. And we're saying at least 2% of the site. So that doesn't sound like much, but when you add up parking areas, the building, and landscaping, 2% ends up being a decent amount. And so these illustrations show how much space that would be. So here's your building. Usually your parking area covers a lot of land, and so this is about the amount of what 2% would be. Or you could break it up into a couple smaller plaza spaces. And then go to your next slide. Again, I think the goal here is to make sure you don't have just this basic development like your old school Safeways that just had your parking lot and a basic little walkway, and you go right in with no amenities. I think the idea is that you try to integrate some pedestrian spaces into developments like that. So these are examples of that. And go to your next slide. So I think those covered the examples. The other important thing is service areas like gas meters, your recycling bins, all that stuff, needing to have some basic standards on where they're located and when you have them, how they're designed and mitigating the impacts. So here's some example on the right, a bad example of just having your gas meters sitting out there with nothing shielding them other than a pole. And the example on the left being a better example where it's kind of tucked more in the back and it has some landscaping in front of it. I think there's some other examples in the document. And another thing is your rooftop service equipment. And this will be more important, particularly down here where you got the hillsides and you're looking down on rooftops. So making sure that efforts are made to kind of shield and minimize the impacts of those rooftops. Any questions or comments on any of that? Good. Take a
Actually,
second here.
I had a comment on the open space portion of it. Looking at the open space, I noticed that on the on-site open space, accessible, this is page 62 of the draft plan that we had. Accessible areas used for stormwater retention or other multi-purpose recreational and or green spaces can qualify as open space. So I've seen it frequently in kind of more in residential developments around here, I think, where the stormwater retention ponds are considered the open space for the neighborhood or the usable green space, and really they're just stormwater retention ponds.
Yeah.
Is that something that could happen? Is that sort of a way that developers could utilize that?
Well, there I think they really need to design it and really demonstrate and convince the city that the design really functions as a amenity, both a visual amenity and a recreational amenity, I think is the point, because I've seen it done well, and we all know the not well examples that don't really function. There's a picture, if you look at page 68, I'm not sure, so there's an image there that shows sort of a wetland looking thing, and there's a kind of a pathway and some townhouses around it, and that's in Sandpoint, Idaho, where I used to work. And I don't know if that may be kind of a manufacture, like they created a wetland, but it really is neat, and they put this boardwalk over it, and it functions as a really great visual amenity, and because they put the pathway around it, it functions as sort of a recreational amenity. And they have grass areas too next to it, and they got one of these little, book sharing stands in there. And so to me, that's a great example of it done right.
That was page 64 in our packet.
Oh, good.
Okay.
I don't know, I was figuring
I'm looking at the right page because I'm not seeing this.
Okay.
Yeah, it's figure 20, 130, 60, B2.
Yeah.
That's pretty,
I was like,
pretty
how
clever.
is that?
But good point, and so.
I would add that I don't think we have a single pond in Port Orchard that would qualify as open space under this provision. Nobody's taken the effort to design one that would function in that capacity.
So, I mean, one option is to continue to leave it open if they can, if we think the language is good, or if we think it's just, you know, a full stormwater pond, maybe if you feel strongly about it, you could just say no, that it won't qualify. Or maybe the edges do, or, you know, it's just something that we can tweak a bit.
I think maybe some photo examples of what is acceptable and what's not acceptable, showing, you know, the fenced-in Walmart stormwater pond is not acceptable, and then finding a couple of examples like this one in Sandpoint, maybe. I think they did one at High Point in West Seattle, where they actually have a walking path with benches around their stormwater pond on the east corner of that project.
Yeah, I think for it to serve as all, I think you need that space to walk around it. There needs to be some usable space that you can use for it to
Yeah, it's not
really
not a
apply.
visual
It can't just be a pond and you can't touch it and you can only see it from the units. That to me wouldn't work. So we probably need to strengthen the criteria here to make it work for you, to make sure that you can walk around it and there's parts of it that can be used and touched.
There's one at the, right by the Y in Gig Harbor that's in that development, and they put fish in there too. It's catch and release, and it's pretty,
Nice.
pretty
Is it an
unique, actually.
apartment what kind of development is it?
So there's like,
Oh, it's the Y.
It's over here, and Costco's over here, and then they built houses around it, and it actually looks really nice.
I think a better designation between the stormwater retention and/or public wetlands area. It looks like what you're showing us on 64 is more of a wetlands area they've incorporated into that complex.
Yes. But it could be a similar thing where, actually in Mill Creek, there's a pond that I think is a stormwater pond. I don't know I think we drove by it really quickly. But it's at least a visual amenity, but I can't remember what the walking paths and everything around it. But anyways, I think what we'll try to do is work on the language a little bit and make sure that it can't just be all pond. There needs to be some space that are usable. So maybe another option could be that the pond itself, maybe there's some limitation to how much of the total percentage that could be used. And it could only be used if it has some of the pathways around it and something like that.
Are the stormwater retention ponds themselves included in another set of design standards? Like that Walmart, I'm thinking about that Walmart pond with the chain link fence around it. Would that still, I didn't see anything in here that specifically applied to the landscaping of those retention ponds.
Yeah, that's a great point there. The design of those ponds is very technical, and so it's a technical manual that dictates how those are to be designed, and so we don't have any landscape screening requirements for them or anything else that would conceal those more than just having a chain link fence. So perhaps that's something that we need to either put into our landscape code or add to this as well.
Is there anything that we've got on the books now that says Walmart, you can't do that, and put your pond on street frontage again, put it behind the building perhaps?
Yeah, I think things get a little bit more difficult because of the types of soils you have on a site, and it would be difficult to comply with our federal permit and force them not to use the infiltrated soils on their site. So I don't know that we could dictate it like we do with parking lots as much, but it's something worth considering. I think there is.
Or underground storm retention?
But at least they could have put better fencing, because it would be sad to have, all these beautiful new design standards implemented and then chain link fencing in front with a pond.
Well, we have requirements for trash enclosures.
Yeah.
And so it almost seems
Similar.
ponds is kind of is similar to other utilities.
Yeah, maybe this is something we need to talk a little bit more about too. We do have in other design standards, we've integrated some guidelines at least on locating them and designing them and integrating them. You're right, they do have their technical, they have a certain amount that they need to have done. They probably need such a massive amount that they need to meet all those technical standards, and they probably want to minimize the amount of area that they want to take up, so they just do the basic thing. So they would probably have to do it differently. I imagine they would have to take up more land, and it might be harder to turn it into amenity unless they make some sacrifices along the way. So let's follow up on that and see what we can do. But also the fencing, I could take a look at your fencing standards and also your landscaping buffer standards along those.
All right.
Okay, should we talk about some building design? Okay, so here we're gonna look at character, massing, details, materials, and blank walls. And the first issue on character, we had some good discussion on this, both at the committee meeting and at the open house workshop on the 15th. I think we all realized that there was no one single character here that you'd want to, that exists in Port Orchard, let alone want to force on anybody. The one character issue that I thought of putting out here is regards kind of chain or corporate architecture, and whether you would allow for kind of that generic corporate architecture. And what I mean by that is architecture that's defined predominantly by these major identity features. And so it's like you see here at the Pizza Hut with the mansard roof there, or the other one is the IHOP with the old steep pitched roof. A third one, so here's your an old IHOP, and in Burien, I joked about that, it's an IHOP, but now it's the Thai hop, because it's actually it's been there for a while now, but it'll always look like the IHOP is part of it. And maybe some communities have adopted standards that prevent this and say, oh, you can do a building and you can do some of your corporate elements, but just don't do these big roof lines or features like that, where if it ever went out of business, it would always look like that chain store or chain restaurant. The other example that I always bring up on this are like the Rite Aid design. They came out for a couple of years, they came out with those diamond window, that corporate design, and they built them all over the place. And on Lake City Way, Lake City Bothell Way, there's like 3 of them on a 3 or 4 mile stretch. And I think at least one of them's out of business, but that to me would be an example of that. And the other point is all these chain stores, they'll come up with plan B, C, and D if they have to. A lot of cities have design standards, and so these are McDonald's pictures that I was collecting for a while from different places, including that upper left one's from Gig Harbor down the freeway, a couple exits. And then there's your other examples in Jasper, up in Canada, Montreal, and Lone Pine, California. So they're prepared to come in. There is one, like sometimes we did some design standards in Boise, for instance, and there was a Blimpies that came in, and this one particular one didn't want to change anything. They wanted to do their basic thing. So that was a case where they couldn't comply with the standards and they didn't want to, so they withdrew their application. Every once in a while there might be one of those that simply don't want to comply, but most of the time they will. So that's kind of an option out there. And what we had talked about too, one thing that Nick had brought up is, well, maybe it's something you consider through the whole city in the commercial areas, or maybe it's something you say we'll have that standard everywhere, but maybe at the freeway interchange, we don't enforce that standard, for instance. So you can kind of pick where you want to have it happen. And before I go on to this next slide, the other thing to think about is maybe after enforcing all these other standards, maybe you might not need to have such a corporate architecture kind of a standard or guideline. That's something to think about as well.
And I guess since you're the recommending body on this, if you have a preference that you'd like to express, I think we'd like to bring forward a version that, reflects what you're looking for. I think our thought was that the area of Bravo Terrace at Sedgwick could potentially be carved out from any corporate architecture requirements, but that the rest of the city would have some restrictions there. But if you have strong feelings about that, please, feel free to share those or discuss that here, and we'll make sure we bring forward something that generally addresses your concern.
Okay. Next slide. Another, probably one of the more important standards in the whole document gets into the facade articulation, the things that you do to kind of add interest and reduce the scale, perceived scale of buildings and facades, both for residential, non-residential. So go back a little bit, just that one slide. So what we've done here is we say buildings, non-residential buildings must include articulation features no more than every 40 feet to create a pattern of small storefronts. And we say provide at least 3 features every 40 feet. And so we provide a list here, and you say do at least 3. And then there's a departure opportunity. You say that if you only want to do 2, or maybe there's an other, we always include like an other treatment that maybe doesn't fit any of the elements in the toolbox. So this building here includes different awnings. It might include different facade materials. It includes a window pattern that's consistent every 30 to 40 feet. Also see the roof line. It has a little roof line change that occurs there. So that's one example. Go to the next slide. So not all, if you applied this to the buildings that you have right now in downtown, some might meet it. Obviously, this one on the right wouldn't. That flat facade is probably more like a 80 or 100 feet wide, so it definitely wouldn't meet that standard. But if you applied that standard, that building would look different, and it would probably be a little more interesting, for instance. Next slide. Same goes with your kind of shopping center strip mall development. This clearly wouldn't meet those standards. But if you redevelop this today, you would apply those types of standards there to kind of break up the buildings a little bit, add more interest to them. Same thing with residential. So again, there's a toolbox of options from roof line to adding balconies to where you put your windows, to break it up no more than every 30 feet. And that's about where the maximum width of a unit in a building. So you could see bay windows could be some, roof line changes, material changes, entries. And the next slide here is showing an example that wouldn't meet it, that maybe not having a building that kind of goes on forever with no roof line changes. So this building would just include the entry pattern, and maybe you can argue the windows, but that's it. And this building, these two buildings show examples that would. So you can see the balconies, material changes, the window features, the one on the left, some roof line changes, all those things to help meet the standards in different ways. And then when you go into a bigger scale, when you get bigger buildings like this, you see this building has a lot of articulation, ins and outs, a little bit of a roof line change, but it goes on forever and it kind of looks like a barracks because it's all the same color. And maybe these small little things don't do much when you're looking at a really big building. So what we're saying is when you have a building that's bigger than, say, like 120 feet like this, that maybe you need to do something a little bigger to break it up. So what we've come up with is we say, well, again, if the building's bigger than 100 feet, you need to do at least one of these features. And we have a list of 3, and then we say other features. So we say, like, for instance, here, the building on the left, if it's less than 100 or 120 feet, then it's fine. It doesn't have to meet these standards. But if it's more than that, then you would have to integrate one of these features. And one of them might be like a bigger courtyard that separates the buildings, like in the image at the bottom. So these buildings here, like the one on the left, by having that entry pop out, that's a significant enough feature that would help meet it. The building on the lower right includes a lot of variable things, and so that would be more like a departure where they wouldn't meet the base 3 options of the standards, but I think they've done enough variable things, so I think that'd be a good departure option. Any questions on that or any of those articulation features? Details are the other important thing, to make sure that there's some details that are integrated into the facades, particularly for non-residential mixed-use buildings. So what we've done there is we've provided for a list, and we've said, okay, you need to do at least one window or entry treatment, and here's a list of options. And you need to do at least one of these every articulation feature, so every 30 or 40 feet. And the next page here shows a number of examples, whether they might be transom windows or a decorative window, window shades, or a recessed entry, or like these roll-up garage doors. Those would be examples. Another one could be decorative. We say do at least one building element, attached element, such as a weather protection, decorative weather protection feature. Like A is a retractable awning, or C are those decorative lights that light up the facade and the sign. D and E are decorative canopies or weather protection elements, or F, including the tower treatment there in the corner. And then building materials and other facade elements, we say do at least one, and in the document we provide a list of 7 or 8. And so they could be decorative use of brick, or decorative emblems, use of glass block like the F there, or decorative baseboard in example E, or mosaic tiles on D. The point is, if you get, say, a strip mall comes in that wants to build a big building that's intended to be for multi-tenants, oftentimes the retailers will come in and put their details in, but you should really make sure that at least the base building shell has some details, like some sconce lights that are decorative, and not just be a basic curtain wall storefront that has just no visual amenities. I mean, those are the strip malls that are going to have vacancies over time and are going to be the ones that get shut down and aren't going to work, especially in this day and age with Amazon. So need to make sure they're interesting and attractive. Window design is another thing that are included here, and this is particularly important for the upper level windows for multifamily or office. And so we're saying that you must either have the windows themselves must either be recessed or projected by 2 inches, or have trim around the windows. And so the one on the bottom there that has no trim, no detailing, and is flat on the wall wouldn't be allowed. And go to your next image. So this shows an example of just kind of that ephes stucco facade, and with no window detailing. That example's in Renton. But the image on the right uses kind of the same materials. And let me get my pointer out. So this material here is the same material as this, but they've integrated different materials, and they have a little bit of detailing on the window. They also provide these decorative ledges. So I would say that this would be a good departure option, where they've done enough with the design here with the windows meet the intent, where this one would not. Cornice and roof line. So on buildings that have a flat roof, we looked at adding some language there to make sure that there's a distinctive roof line. And we had a good discussion at, actually I think it was mostly at the advisory committee workshops. And then we also had a discussion again at the open house. So here it says that buildings employing a flat roof must employ a distinctive roof line that effectively provides an identifiable top to the building. And these are examples. This has kind of a little cornice here. This has more of a traditional cornice in addition to the pitched roofs. So actually something the mayor had suggested was that maybe we update this and just apply these to multifamily and mixed use buildings, and maybe not applying them to commercial buildings. So that's a possible change to the language there.
I don't know what happened here. There we go.
Oh, okay, so that's cornice line. And then we're kind of getting in the home stretch here. There's a number of, getting into building materials, there's a number of common materials that usually need some special conditions that go with them when you use them. And one of them is concrete block. Concrete block is, it's affordable. You see it around a lot. It's readily available. And you can do a great job with it, but, if you don't do it right, it can also not be great as well. So there's some standards that say that, okay, you can use it as a cladding material if it incorporates other permitted materials and incorporates a combination of textures and colors to add interest. So, good examples. I'm working in Bozeman, Montana. So this example, this is all concrete block, and they use smooth face, kind of a glazed concrete block here, and then they use more of that colored split face there, and it mixes really well, works good with trying to break up the articulation of the building. Same example here in Bellevue on their main street. So this is above each of the awnings. They put kind of brown split face. It's got that texture on it. And notice that they have these columns are plain gray concrete blocks. And so they create this pattern that works with the articulation. And then they've occasionally used these little decorative black tile kind of concrete blocks there. So I'd say it's one of the better examples of using it. So, and then here in Bellevue, also where I live, just using this big expanse of just plain gray, that more of kind of, to me, degrades the street. It sort of turns its back on it and doesn't add interest. So I'd say that's probably a bad example of it. Some other materials that you might look at having special standards for are metal siding. And one question is, for some of these material standards, you have the opportunity to treat different parts of town differently. For one instance, you could say that, metal buildings are fine out on Bethel or Sedgwick or whatever it is, but maybe I don't want them downtown. Or maybe you want to require them in some areas, for instance. But those are options. But for right now, what our draft says is that metal may be used as a secondary cladding material, provided that it's incorporated with other materials and complies with the following. So making sure that you have corner molding and trim. And another one is make sure that metal doesn't extend down to the sidewalk level, that you break it up with some concrete. So these three buildings are examples where you have some metal mixed with brick. And here you have it's brick up at the front and you got metal in the back. This has metal at top and brick at the bottom. And if you go to the next page, so this wouldn't meet it. This is just all metal. So that's an example of that wouldn't meet the standards that we've written here so far in any part of the city right now, but that's up for discussion. This building, here's metal. This is in Bellingham, and it has brick here, and it has either concrete or ephes or hardy board. So that example would meet it. It's got good trim. The windows would meet the standards. It's got articulation. So when you look at these, we want to look at all these standards together. So you have the articulation, the massing standards, you have the details, the window standards, and then we're layering on top these building material standards. So it's important when we're looking at either limiting the types of mixed materials, it's important to think of how they all work with everything together. And so one consideration is after you apply the articulation and window standards, it may be having a building that's primarily metal rather than secondary. That maybe that would be okay in some parts, or maybe in all of the city, maybe even in downtown. So I'm challenging you to kind of think about that and figuring, what the right approach is here. So the one part of metal, though, that I think you should have at minimum is, here's example in Woodinville and Mill Creek where you just have metal going down to the sidewalk. And I often think it doesn't look finished when you have this case. In cases like in the next slide, where you have, this is metal right here, and by putting concrete block or concrete and concrete block right here, usually kind of a better way of finishing it up on the sidewalk environment. So I would say that, I would recommend that standard. Say when you have metal on your facade, require that the metal stop and a more permanent material or concrete or stone or whatever be the bottom 2 feet. The other important one is EIFS, or it's just like a stucco-like material. It's an acronym for Exterior Insulation and Finishing System. You see it all over the place. It's inexpensive, it's flexible, it can be done well and it can be done poorly. Here we're suggesting that you limit it, you can use it, but you limit it to only 20% of the facade, and it may not be the primary cladding material. And we're saying that also that when you use it on the ground floor, we're saying probably a good idea is just not allowing it on like commercial ground floor up against the sidewalk, because it is easy to chip away, especially at the corner. I would definitely say don't use it within 2 feet of the ground. But I also say that maybe you consider not allowing it on the ground floor, because it really doesn't have the texture of other materials, even concrete block, for instance. So here's an example of not doing it well. This is down the street from where I live. They just put it down here between the storefronts and the sidewalk. It looks terrible. But here's a better example in Boise. They have this building has concrete block, and then they have brick, and then on the second floor they have EIFS, and they have nice window details and scoring patterns. It's hard to see in this photo, but it looks really good there in that example. And here's other examples. So this Petco is almost entirely EIFS, except for a little bit of tile here. And here's an example where it's just all the upper floor, and at least they put brick on the first floor. But all of those would be considered primary materials, and it wouldn't meet the 20% secondary standard that are in the draft code. Here's a better example. Again, this is that building in Boise that I mentioned, where they put brick on the first kind of floor and a half, and then they have it, you can see it here, this kind of yellowish color, but they've mixed in, again, with the articulation and the iron balconies, and there's some other like hardy panel material here where these bay windows are. So they've effectively broken it up. So that's probably more than 20%, but I would say that it's so well done that I would probably allow a departure for that. And this is an option where we're allowing departures. So it's really, when you get into these building materials, I think these will be the common examples where you may get departure requests. And I think that by allowing that extra little bit of review, and it kind of allows the negotiation for the city to say, well, if it's good and they can really demonstrate that it meets the intent, that then you would allow it. The last thing in this whole thing is there's some blank wall standards. And so what we've done is we've defined blank wall by saying any wall that doesn't have a window or door that's greater than 15 feet wide and 10 feet tall, that you must, go to your next page, that you must treat it either with landscaping to cover it up or design treatments to help mitigate it. And not simply like this example in Tacoma where they put a bunch of tack-on display cases with some posters inside of it. It's still a blank wall in that case. So so that's our draft. That's kind of the highlights of the draft design standards. So the big thing are we on the right track on this thing? I know that's a lot of material there, but I've worked on a lot of these with different cities and had the chance to see them work and actually do design review on these types of standards and kind of refine the approach and over time as I've worked with cities and kind of looking at how to apply, whether it's detail standards or material standards, it's been really helpful to kind of figure out what works. And so it's here, at least this is our impression of what we think could work here in Port Orchard given the situation. And another important thing I want to bring up too is our economics. And since these do allow commonly used materials, a lot of the standards are kind of looking at, where you put your parking and in the building, and a lot of these really shouldn't add cost to development beyond what the typical developers in this area are doing. It's more of kind of the thoughtful siting of things and the thoughtful articulation of facades. What we're trying to do is it's really hard to legislate great design, but I think we're trying to prevent the worst stuff and encourage the good stuff. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, what we're trying to do with this.
So, I guess before I talk about some next steps, if there are any questions about the substance of what you've seen today, this is kind of the qualitative aspects of design that we're looking to address. The documents that will be brought forward for you to consider will include process for how we handle the review, and also what other sections of code are being repealed in conjunction with the adoption of these. Right now, we have a design review board that I don't think has met for several years. They only look at projects in downtown, and so we need to reconcile how design review downtown corresponds with these standards. We also have we have the Tremont design standards, and so a lot of what's in this document are already applied in Tremont, but nowhere else. And so we need to figure out which of the Tremont regulations get repealed as this gets adopted citywide. And so you will see some additional material at the January meeting. We're still putting the finishing touches on that. But this is really what we're looking to adopt going forward, and we're going to tie up all the loose ends between now and January. So any questions?
I just had a procedural question. So currently, if there's a building that's proposed to be built in downtown, it would go through the design review board. With these standards, if they're implemented, a building anywhere within the city limits of Port Orchard, if it's proposed, then where does it go to make sure that the standards are met? Would that be your office or?
Yeah,
what?
so the planning department, the planners who review projects for compliance with our zoning standards would be doing this review. Since we had created the design review board, we've had 4 projects come forward for a proposal downtown, and only 2 of them even followed through with the process because it was so convoluted and complex. Right now, we have no adopted written standards for what we're looking for. There's a paragraph that says that the city wants architecture representative of the late 1800s in downtown, and it sort of leaves it up to you to figure out whether that's 1890s Tokyo or 1890s London. And so I think what we're doing right now is fairly arbitrary, and it involves a lot of the design review board members actually providing direction to the architect rather than evaluating a proposal against criteria. And so we're trying to make this really predictable for developers so that if they can use these menus and design something that meets our standards, they should be able to get administrative approval without having to go to a board. We're still trying to figure out what the board's role is going forward, whether they would review just departure
Any other questions?
You're good.
Is that it?
Looks good.
Yeah, I guess, did you have any feedback at all? I think the couple of variables that we had were the corporate architecture. Is there any general feeling from the planning commission on whether you'd like to see those restrictions in there, partially in there in the geographic area, or not deal with them because the other standards are gonna sort of take care of a lot of those issues?
Wouldn't they apply, I mean, corporate architecture could be any chain store then, right? Like a Walmart or a
It has to be,
whatever.
it has to include a significant like a giant mansard roof or thing like that, that is strictly, once you see that architectural shape, you know it's the chain. So if it's just, you know, a lot of businesses have, they vary the design, or, you know, the building might not have features that are super expensive to take away if the chain ever leaves. So, you know, Walmart doesn't really, they have certain corporate designs, but I don't think, based on the architectural features, that it would be prohibited
So
as
like-
corporate
Like
architecture here.
Safeway. Safeway would.
Safeway has a lot of different designs, and I can't think of, one in particular right now that would be, that's a Safeway, you know, they're all kind of different, and the big ones are the IHOP kind of things,
McDonald's.
McDonald's and even now they're changing their design so much, they don't use the mansard roofs hardly at all anymore. But are those things where, yes, it always looks like that chain.
Isn't Starbucks kind of that way? I mean,
No, they're not.
They may put the different,
They just have their logos and things, but
but aren't the shapes of their buildings pretty much the same? It's just how they're putting the paneling or whatever like Belfair has the paneling, and I don't know.
there might be some similarities, but it's nothing that's, to me, that would be out of the ordinary here and you'd want to prohibit. They mix things up so much. I've seen thousands of Starbucks in there.
Yeah, I can see the
There's-
things we're talking about in our area though. a little
Yeah.
bit, But they look good.
Yeah,
I don't,
they
I
do
wouldn't,
look good.
yeah, and I wouldn't mind like, you know, keeping the corporate architecture in like the Bravo Terrace area, but I think it would be distracting. Like if you go down Mile Hill right now, you can see without a doubt where the old Taco Bell used to be,
Right.
you know? So if we wanna,
Yeah.
you know, keep our neighborhood themes intact, I don't know if I would particularly, I mean, if we could discourage that, I would like that. And I also think it's kinda neat how we can, you know, if we so desire to designate themes in certain areas to distinguish those areas too, I think is kinda neat. You know, like if you only wanted the metal architecture idea in one area and so on.
Yeah, if there's certain parts of town you want to promote whether it's concrete block, or if there are themes or things that you want to promote in different areas, what are they? And what standards, guidelines could go with that? You know, maybe metal's good in Tremont, but not in other areas, for instance. So those things would be good to know. I mean, you have a lot of opportunity to really shape things here and mix things up a bit.
I'm sure that, you know, when we have citizen inputs, I mean, that would probably be a creative thing on most people's part. I have no idea, but I just think that's kind of a neat advantage. And, I mean, I'm really excited to see a lot of this. You know, this was really what I was hoping for.
Well, I would, we're gonna try to get the final draft for the hearing to you as early as possible, in advance of our special meeting on the 10th of January. We rescheduled because of, the New Year's holiday. I think, a lot of us are gonna be out of the office, and it's hard to, come in after a week off and hit the ground running. So,
Thank you.
Thank
Okay,
you.
Thank you. So do you want to approve the minutes? Isn't that the next thing? Yeah.
Not to abstain.
I'll make a motion to approve last month's minutes as written.
I'll second.
Can we do it?
Do we have a quorum? Okay,
Okay.
even if we have an abstention?
Yeah, you just have to have enough people in the meeting to vote. It doesn't matter if somebody abstains.
Okay.
All right. So all those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? There we go. That's it. Anybody have anything else?
Merry
Okay.
Christmas.
Yeah, we're done.
Thanks.